Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a massive paradigm shift when it comes to the history of human civilization. We're going to look at a pattern that spans across completely disconnected cultures, across vast periods of time, and totally different geographies. It's a topic that's honestly just as historically fascinating as it is profoundly relevant to how we're living right now. Together, we're going to unpack the hidden structural factors that cause incredibly powerful, highly complex societies to, well, just break down and vanish.
You know what's really wild about this concept? It completely reframes how we look at our modern world. The seemingly permanent, unshakable societies of today, like the United States, the European Union, or China, are actually just new configurations built right on top of the physical ruins and cultural legacies of predecessors that failed. The Bronze Age kingdoms, the Western Roman Empire, the Maya, the Khmer Empire, they all ultimately collapsed. And this isn't just survivorship bias, the idea that we only focus on the successful societies that survive long enough to write the history books. No, the historical pattern of eventual collapse is incredibly real, and it points to a universal set of structural vulnerabilities that every single expanding society is eventually going to have to face.
Okay, first things first, we've got to define our terms clearly right out of the gate. Because when historians and archaeologists talk about a collapse, they aren't using some literary metaphor, and they're not talking about a temporary economic recession. They're describing a material, demographic fact that can literally be measured in the dirt. We are talking about a rapid, catastrophic reduction in social complexity, and it usually happens within a remarkably short matter of decades. It involves the total disintegration of long-distance trade networks, the abandonment of monumental urban centers, the loss of writing systems, and, quite often, a massive and tragic reduction in human population. So, true civilizational collapse is a totally unique structural failure. It is completely different from a gradual political transformation, or, say, simply being conquered by an outside army. It's not just one political form slowly turning into another over a few centuries. When the classic Maya cities emptied out into the jungle, or when Roman populations plummeted so far that their magnificent cities wouldn't recover for literally 1,000 years, that was a fundamental systemic failure. It's a complete internal breakdown of the society's operating system, not just a loss on the battlefield. Section 1. The cost of complexity. Building the house of cards. As archaeologist Joseph Tainter laid out in his theories, societies naturally build complexity to solve their problems. To manage a growing population, you add administration. Defend your borders, add a military. Need to move food around, you build massive infrastructure. But eventually, the returns on that investment just inevitably diminish. Think about it like a rapidly growing corporation. At first, hiring a manager solves a massive bottleneck. But as you expand, you eventually have to hire managers just to manage the managers, right? And then an HR department to manage them, and an auditing team to check on everybody. Every new layer of bureaucracy provides a little less actual benefit to the society, but it costs just as much to maintain. Eventually, keeping that massive, bloated system running costs way more than it actually produces. Because a society is totally tapped out just trying to maintain its baseline existence, it has zero reserves left. So any sudden shock triggers a cascade failure. The Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean, around 1200 BCE, is the absolute perfect example of this precarious house of cards. Their highly complex supply chains for manufacturing bronze were total marvels of the ancient world. You had the Ugaritic palace economy importing tin from as far away as Afghanistan and mixing it with copper from Cyprus. But this immense, hyper-efficient interconnectivity actually became the exact mechanism of their rapid downfall. When just a few key nodes failed, thanks to sudden climate shifts and internal rebellions, it created an opening. Enter the mysterious Sea Peoples, a massive confederation of migrating raiders who just swept through the Mediterranean. Because every state was so heavily dependent on the others for vital resources and defense, they couldn't bail each other out. When a few key cities fell to the raiders, the entire international network came crashing down within a single generation, plunging the whole region into a dark age. Moving on to Section 2, Environmental Stress and Elite Extraction. The squeeze on resources. Civilizations are never, ever truly separate from their ecosystems. They're entirely physically dependent on them. The Maya classic collapse shows how a society's own massive land use practices can literally become their undoing. See, the Maya needed enormous amounts of raw timber to fuel the superheated fires required to process limestone. That limestone made the brilliant white cement for their incredible monuments and cities. But doing this resulted in massive, widespread deforestation. And this clear-cutting eliminated forest evapotranspiration, which is basically the natural process where millions of trees act like biological water pumps, releasing moisture into the air to create localized rain. By removing the trees, they actively changed their own local climate, driving up temperatures and severely reducing rainfall.
So when a natural, long-term drought finally hit, it struck an ecosystem that the civilization itself had already pushed far past its breaking point. They had essentially burned through their own environmental resilience. Now, layered right on top of this environmental strain, there's always a fierce political economy at play. Peter Turchin's research in climatodynamics, which uses mathematical models to track deep historical trends, shows a constant internal pressure present in almost all complex societies: elite overextraction. The historical math basically shows that over time, elites progressively consume more and more of the society's surplus. They needed to fund their luxury goods, their complex administration, and their competing patronage networks. But this physically starves the productive base, the everyday peasants, farmers, and artisans who actually keep the entire machine running. When farmers are taxed beyond their physical ability to maintain their farms and feed their own families, overall agricultural productivity just plummets. The extraction system essentially eats its own productive foundation from the inside out. All right, Section 3, Fragile Knowledge and Disease, Losing the Blueprint. At this point, you might be wondering, why don't leaders just fix these glaring problems when the warning signs start flashing red? Well, historian Jared Diamond sums this up perfectly. The failure to anticipate and respond to these existential threats is very often due to a profound conflict of interest between the elites who benefit from the status quo and the society's desperate need to change it. The elites holding the levers of power have the most to lose from adapting. Downsizing complexity, that costs money and political power. Redistributing wealth away from the top to save the crumbling productive base, that directly reduces their status. So this political gridlock completely blocks a civilization from making the structural pivots necessary to save itself. And this elite gridlock leads directly to institutional failure. Complex civilizations actually encode their ultimate survival in highly fragile institutional knowledge. When the Western Roman Empire fell, they didn't lose the physical stones, and the rivers didn't dry up. What they lost was the fragile, highly specialized institutional knowledge required to organize tens of thousands of laborers, manage continent-spanning supply chains, and perfectly mix the precise volcanic ash required for Roman concrete. That knowledge wasn't written down in some widely distributed textbook. It lived almost exclusively in the minds of a few specialized guilds and administrative systems. When the economic surplus dried up and those administrative systems failed, the actual, literal blueprint of the civilization vanished completely within a single generation. And of course, we absolutely cannot ignore the role of sudden demographic shocks like widespread disease. But the historical role of disease isn't as simple as you might think. It depends entirely on a society's existing resilience reserves. For instance, when the Antonine Plague hit a tapped-out Roman Empire that was already stretched to its absolute structural limits, it massively accelerated its fall by wiping out the tax base and emptying the military recruiting pool. They had absolutely no capacity to recover. But contrast that with the Black Death hitting 14th century Europe. That was a society that actually still had sufficient adaptive capacity and untapped resources. The staggering loss of life paradoxically meant there was nobody left to harvest the crops. That meant the surviving peasants could suddenly demand much higher wages and better living conditions. It structurally redistributed wealth downward, breaking the feudal system and helping to spark the Renaissance. The exact same biological shock produced entirely different structural outcomes, based solely on the society's internal capacity to adapt. Section 4, the invisible collapse, the lived experience. So here is a crucial question to consider. Why didn't the people actually living through these massive historical events see the end coming? Why was it always so consistently unexpected? It's because, from the inside, highly complex systems expertly mask systemic failure. People didn't experience a dramatic, cinematic collapse overnight where everything just burned down in a day. They just lived through a confusing, slow-moving accumulation of hyper-local failures. They'd see a moderately bad harvest in one province. A few years later, a major trading road gets washed out by a flood. And for some reason, the capital just never sends anyone to fix it. Then, grain prices slowly start creeping up just a bit faster than their incomes. Gradually, merchants start noticing that bandits are getting much bolder on the trade routes, and the local garrisons are suddenly drastically understaffed. Complex systems are designed to absorb these local shocks by spreading the pain around, but when they finally cross a critical threshold, the cascade happens all at once. By the time the systemic terminal failure is actually obvious to the average citizen on the street, the structural rot is so deep that it's typically way too late to reverse it. Finally, Section 5, the modern experiment, echoes in the present. When we lay this historical blueprint over our modern world, the objective parallels are honestly pretty striking. The overextended, hyper-fragile trade networks of the Bronze Age deeply echo the cascading global supply chain shocks we all experienced during the 2020 pandemic. Our massive industrial modifications to the planetary climate and global biodiversity eerily mirror the Mayas' relentless depletion of their own environmental carrying capacity. On top of that, 5 decades of measurably rising income inequality across developed nations tracks perfectly with Tuchin's historical models of Roman elite extraction. And finally, the loss of fragile institutional knowledge in Rome, well, that looks an awful lot like our complete reliance on a highly specialized, easily disrupted digital and administrative tech infrastructure that very, very few people actually know how to rebuild from scratch.
But here is the ultimate takeaway from all this. History is not a rigid, deterministic doom loop. This is not a prophecy. The fundamental difference between the civilizations that catastrophically shattered into dust and those that successfully managed a controlled descent or transformation relies entirely on this concept of adaptive capacity. It's all about a society's collective willingness and political ability to actively control its own complexity, to radically alter its environmental practices, and to structurally redistribute its resources back to the productive base before the ultimate breaking point is reached. Survival isn't guaranteed by wealth or technology. It's an ongoing active choice made through collective action.
Every fallen empire, from the kings of the Maya to the emperors of Rome, left behind a detailed, highly visible record in the dirt, in the ice cores, and in the archaeological data of exactly how and why their brilliant systems failed. They left us the explicit blueprint of their own demise, which leaves us with one ultimate, lingering question to consider. Did the civilizations that came after learn anything from the ones that came before? Or are we destined to repeat the